All right, take it away.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Riley Rozniarek, and I am a research specialist in the Berg Lab at the Laureate Institute for Brain Research. Today, I am going to be talking to you about threat-related behavior, specifically repetitive threat neutralization, and a task that we've designed in the lab to elicit this behavior. To begin, I want to give a big thanks to everyone on the screen who's been involved in bringing the tap to safety task to life. And starting with some background, there are a couple main types of threat-related behavior. First is active avoidance, which is when you perceive a threat and take an action to avoid it, such as running away. And then there's also passive avoidance, which is when you perceive a threat and withhold action to avoid it, such as freezing. And then we have this third type where you perceive a threat and repeatedly take an action to try to neutralize the threat. That can be repeated washing, checking, redoing. When we're looking at obsessive compulsive disorder, this may be more like compulsions where you're seeing repeated washing. And then in anxiety disorders, this may be more like repeated reassurance seeking. We have tasks and a wealth of research that looks at active and passive avoidance, but we truly don't have access to a truly validated and MRI compatible task that elicits this repetitive threat neutralization behavior. So that was the goal of creating the tap to safety task. We wanted to create a task that was compatible with the MRI and elicited repetitive threat neutralization to potentially identify target treatment areas. Starting off with how the task works, we have two safety cues in the task. These are shapes that are safe or never paired with an aversive outcome. And then we have three generalization shapes, or the middle-sized rings, as we like to call them. These get continuously closer in shape to the shape that does have the aversive outcome, but are still safe. And then we have one threat cue or threatening shape that is paired with an aversive outcome. In the task, there are two main types of trials. We have passive trials where participants view a shape on the screen and then give a self-reported risk or anxiety rating and see the outcome. And then we have choice trials where participants view the shape on the screen, give a self-reported risk or anxiety rating, and then they're shown a screen that says they may tap soon. After that, they have the ability to repeatedly tap with their non-dominant pinky, and this is where that eliciting the repetitive threat neutralization comes into play. So the more that they tap, the more protection they have from the aversive outcome, but in contrast, it halts their accumulation of points. And they have the option to engage in this behavior repetitively, eliciting repetitive threat neutralization. And then they give a second self-reported risk or anxiety rating and see the outcome. For the task structure, the TTS task starts off with the Pavlovian learning phase. And this phase, they learn the association between the shapes that are safe and the shape that is associated with the aversive outcome. Next is neutralization, training, and feedback. We start off with a speed test to get their maximum tapping speed, and then have participants tap differing amounts to learn the relationship between protection and points. So during this portion, they learn that tapping a large amount gives them higher protection from the aversive outcome, but lower points, and vice versa. Then we have three testing phases of the task, which can be done in the MRI scanner. The first testing phase is the discrimination phase. This is when what they've learned is reinforced. Then we have the generalization phase. This is where we add in three middle-sized rings that are also safe. And then we have the extinction phase where the threat is taken away. So why is the TTS task novel? Well, first, it's versatile across multiple modalities. As I mentioned, it is compatible with the MRI scanner, but it can also be done without MRI. It's also been tested on online research platforms, specifically the Prolific platform, and it can be done in person as well. We also have adaptable aversive stimuli delivery. We have tested with a shock stimulator using a digitimer, as well as with negative images using images of disgust and fear through the International Affective Picture System. And the TTS task is also relevant across multiple populations. As I mentioned, it is testing a common type of threat-related or avoidance-related behavior that is understudied. It's also been tested in healthy individuals as well as those with anxiety disorders and obsessive-compulsive disorder. And then finally, there are multiple measures within the task that you can look at, including the repetitive threat neutralization behavior, as well as risk ratings and anxiety ratings before and after that behavior. And then if it is done in the MRI, you have the measures associated with that as well. And then finally, it's shareable across institutions. Currently at Utrecht University under Dr. Kripotos, he's testing an addition of an unavoidable threat cue, as well as new individual differences such as intolerance of uncertainty or adverse childhood experience. And then at University of Minnesota, Dr. Lisa Anderson is adapting the task to be used in anorexia nervosa population. And finally, at the Laureate Institute, we have completed an in-person and online pilot, as well as an ongoing study focusing on the task in an OCD population. And then we're also piloting a new version of the task that's shorter and mainly focused on examining differences in extinction and effort. Taking a look at some of our results, starting with our online pilots, this used the Prolific platform for recruitment. We used negative images as the aversive outcome or aversive stimuli. And then participants tapped Q on their keyboard with their non-dominant pinky as that repetitive threat neutralization behavior. For this study, we had 89 participants complete, and we had about 71% that were male. The mean age was about 31, and then race demographics are shown on the screen. Getting into the results of this study, in the discrimination phase, or when they're tested on what they've learned so far, we can see that individuals had higher risk ratings to the threat cue or CS plus in orange compared to the safety cues in blue, showing that they did learn that basic threat association. And then in the generalization phase, when we added in those middle-sized rings never paired with the aversive outcome, we see that there was higher tapping when we're looking at the percentage of tapping in regards to their max taps across the stimuli types, with the highest amount of tapping to the threat cue in orange compared to the safety cues in blue. And then finally, during extinction, when we take that threat away, we saw greater tapping to the former threat cue. And you can see in the graph, looking at their percentage of tapping, that they had the highest amount of tapping to the threat cue in orange compared to the safety cues in blue when looking across the trials of the extinction phase. Next, we did an in-person pilot study, and for this one, we tested a shock paradigm. We also wanted to get a wide range of anxiety-related traits, mostly focused on anxiety sensitivity, as well as various anxiety disorders. For this in-person study, we had 67 people complete with a mean age of 35, and about 72% were female. We did have 61% healthy controls and then 39% that had an anxiety disorder. This plot shows the distribution of anxiety sensitivity, which is the fear of the potential negative consequences associated with anxiety. And we were particularly interested in this because it's been linked to anxiety disorders and OCD. You can see on the plot that the mean was about 17, which is close to the clinical cutoff of 21, but we did get a range, a wide distribution across anxiety sensitivity scores. And then for the different anxiety disorders that we had within this population, there were 9 with generalized anxiety disorder, 1 with social anxiety disorder, 7 with panic, and 15 with OCD. This does include individuals who had more than one disorder at a time. Taking a look at the differences we saw within anxiety sensitivity, starting off with that discrimination phase where we're testing that threat association, we see that across the levels of anxiety sensitivity, everyone learned that basic threat association. This graph is looking at risk ratings to the various stimulus types or shapes in low, medium, and high anxiety sensitivity. And we can see that in each panel of the graph, no matter what their anxiety sensitivity was, they had higher risk ratings to the threatening shape in orange compared to the safe shapes in blue. And then during generalization, when we added in those middle-sized rings that were still never associated with the shock, those with higher anxiety sensitivity had higher tapping to the threat cue. So when we're looking at this graph, it's the percentage of tapping compared to their max taps. And in the far right panel of the graph with high anxiety sensitivity, we can see they had higher percentage of tapping to that threat cue in orange when compared with lower medium anxiety sensitivity. We thought we might see similar tapping to the generalization shapes or those middle-sized rings, as well as with the threat cue, but we did not see that. And then where things got interesting was when we took a look at our extinction findings. And remember, extinction is the phase where we've taken that threat away. Here we can see that those with higher anxiety sensitivity had greater risk ratings to the former threat cue. So although we've taken the threat away at this point, those with higher anxiety sensitivity had greater risk ratings across the trials of the extinction phase compared to those with lower medium anxiety sensitivity. And you can see this with their risk ratings in orange to the threat cue. And then when looking at tapping during extinction, we can see that those with high anxiety sensitivity in the far right panel of the graph had higher tapping to that former threat cue in orange compared to low and medium anxiety sensitivity. This shows that individuals with higher anxiety sensitivity are more likely to hold on to that perceived risk to the former threat cue, as well as greater engagement in repetitive threat neutralization behavior through tapping in the task. Next, looking at group differences. Again, during that first testing phase, we see that in both groups, the healthy controls and those with an anxiety disorder diagnosis, they both learned the basic threat association and had higher risk ratings to the threat cue in orange compared to the safety cues. And then again, we saw interesting results in the extinction phase. Remembering again, this is the phase where we've taken that threat away, there is no more aversive outcome. We see that those with an anxiety disorder diagnosis have greater risk ratings across the trials of the extinction phase when compared with healthy controls. And this is shown in orange on the screen. And then similar to with anxiety sensitivity, those with anxiety disorders also had greater tapping to the former threat cue during extinction. So this graph again is looking at the percentage of tapping across the trials of the extinction phase. So as the time is going on with the extinction, we see that those with an anxiety disorder diagnosis had increased tapping to the threat cue or former threat cue seen in orange, despite this now being maladaptive because there is no longer a threat. For our MRI results, during stimulus onset or when that shape is first shown on the screen, we saw differed activity across stimuli, with the greatest activity being to the threat cue in the anterior insula. And then during the tap preparation phase, when participants are told they may tap soon, we saw that in the discrimination phase, there was activity in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, insula, caudate, and putamen that differed across stimuli, again, with the greatest activity being to the threat cue. And then during the generalization phase, we saw gradients of activation in the anterior insula and striatal regions. The most interesting MRI results, in my opinion, were when we looked at neural activity to the tap preparation phase and how that was associated with tapping. So these graphs are looking at, as neural activity is increasing, what the percentage of tapping compared to their max taps was. And we can see that in the putamen across all phases of the task, higher neural activity was associated with greater tapping or repetitive threat neutralization behavior. And then this was the same for the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex across discrimination and generalization, as well as the anterior insula across generalization. So what do all of these results tell us? Well, these results do show that the TTS task sheds light on repetitive threat neutralization behavior. First, we learned that anxiety sensitivity plays a key role in higher engagement of repetitive threat neutralization behaviors and perceived risk, both in the generalization phase and the extinction phase, to that threat cue and former threat cue. And then we also saw that in individuals with an anxiety disorder diagnosis, they had higher perceived risk and higher engagement in repetitive threat neutralization, particularly in uncertain situations like extinction, where we had taken that threat away. And then we showed that repetitive threat neutralization behavior is linked to activity specifically in the anterior insula and dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, which are both core components of the salience network. So they are involved in threat response, and then also the striatal regions, which are involved in action. So this does make sense, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. For future directions, at LIBOR, we do have an ongoing study looking at this task in OCD, as well as using the MRI for that task. We have more data analysis that we want to do. Particularly, we could look at the active brain activation in healthy individuals versus in OCD individuals and look at differences among that. But because we did see the most interesting results during that extinction phase, we are working on piloting a new version of the task that's shorter and also includes longer extinction to really get at those individual differences during extinction. We also are including effort ratings and uncontrollable stimulus and task-related interventions for reducing repetitive threat neutralization in this new version of the task. As mentioned before at Utrecht University, they are testing the addition of an unavoidable threat cue, as well as looking at other individual differences, including uncertainty, intolerance of uncertainty. And then finally, at University of Minnesota, they are adapting this task to be used with an anorexia nervosa population. In summary, the repetitive threat neutralization behavior is important and understudied. We have shown through the task that it is a maladaptive and costly behavior. Through our results today, we've shown that there is strong preliminary evidence supporting the use of this task across our online and in-person versions, as well as in multiple populations. And again, we do have ongoing and upcoming studies at various institutions that are applying to this to new populations as well. And then finally, the TTS task is a modifiable, validated, and collaborative paradigm. So as I've mentioned, it can be modified in a number of ways, and we have shown that it can be used in multiple populations. We've also shared this task with other institutions, and we encourage you to get involved as well. For some discussion questions that you can think about or feel free to include in the chat, can you think of a real-world example of repetitive threat neutralization behavior, maybe through a patient or participant or even a family member or friend? What other populations or questions do you think the TTS task could be useful for, or maybe a way that you think you could implement it in your own lab? And then do you have any other thoughts or questions that we can answer? If you are interested in learning more about the Tap to Safety task or interested in collaboration, I encourage you to email Dr. Hannah Berg at hberg@laureateinstitute.org, as well as using the QR code on the screen to view our preprint on the TTS task. Thank you so much.
Very cool. I had questions, but I'm like, I don't know where to start. Yeah, so I mean, I imagine given the lab name that this was really designed to think about anxiety. But is there like a normal amount of this behavior that is like evolutionarily a good idea? Does that make sense? And then there's this point at which it tips into maladaptive.
That is a great point. And I think historically, when we're looking at not only humans, but all species, there is the need to weigh benefits versus risks in life. And this is a part of that where, when it comes to having a threat, you can take either active or passive avoidance to it, as well as trying to neutralize that threat. But when it gets to the point of repetitively trying to neutralize a threat, maybe past the point of it actually being a threat anymore, as we saw with an extinction, that is when it can become maladaptive and costly. So we saw that our participants with anxiety sensitivity and anxiety diagnoses were continuing to have this repetitive threat neutralization behavior even when the threat had been taken away, and them engaging in the behavior came at the cost of losing out on points.
That makes sense. Because like almost all of your graphs had this most beautiful interaction, right? So like these like perfect simple slopes. So I'm just wondering if there's like something else that like because obviously anxiety is the problem that you deal with drugs and or therapy, right? But like are there other factors that might be I don't want to use mediate or moderate because those have very specific statistical terms, but like help alleviate, that's the word I'm looking for, some of the potential behavioral or cognitive actions? Like, is there something else that you think might be one of the reasons that you could help people bring it down? Because that's kind of where I thought you were going at the end, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'm sure Dr. Bird can talk on it more because she is clinical focused and has more experience in that area. But I do think that this can be used potentially in the future where clinicians can identify these behaviors in their patients and view if these behaviors are getting to the point of being maladaptive and costly. And potentially different types of therapy could include working on this behavior. Dr. Berg, if you'd like to chime in, I'm sure you have more of an idea about that.
Yeah. So well, and yeah. So you were mentioning kind of the next steps and where we're taking the task. So one other future direction that I think you did touch on is we're exploring ways to use the task as sort of an analog for therapy to explore like what are some interventions within the context of the task that we could do that might help us understand what kinds of things would be helpful in therapy. So another thing that we're testing right now is when people do the task and then just as they're getting to the extinction phase, we give them a little one slide intervention that basically gives them different ways to think about what they're about to do. So in one condition, we say, by the way, we want to let you know that people in this task often tap a lot more than they need to. So why don't you try to tap a little bit less this time and see if you can, when you feel anxious, just really push past that anxiety. Don't let your anxiety stand in the way. Push through it and see if you can like face your fears. So that's an analog for exposure therapy because that's the exact kind of thing we say in exposure therapy, like push past the anxiety, face your fears, like that type of thing. And then we're testing another kind of intervention in the task where we don't say anything about facing your fears, but we talk about the reward and the points. So we say, just to let you know, people often tap more than they need to. So what we want you to try to do is think about how many points you could get and see if you can really push and get lots and lots of points. So we don't say anything about fears or facing your fears. And it's kind of an analog for this potential other kind of maybe more positive affect focused therapy, in line with, positive affect treatments or behavioral activation, which would be quite a departure from the traditional exposure-based therapies that are used for anxiety. So by testing that, that might eventually, once we take that into clinical populations, potentially help us understand, are there subtypes of patients who might benefit more from a positive affect or a reward-focused treatment? And are those the patients for whom traditional fear-focused exposure interventions don't work?
Oh, very cool. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Well, I am out of questions and I think I have to run the next session. So I'll stop the recording. It'll be available in like 20 minutes when it's done processing. So you can share with folks if you want. And thank you guys for presenting your work today. It was very cool.
Thank you
Thank you so much.
much.
Have a good one.
You too.